Yeah, welcome. This is ThinkTech. This is Community Matters, and I'm here on a given Thursday with Wilson Moore, who you really have to know if you don't know him already. He's a very important person. We are honored to have him here. He's done so much in his life for this community. Hi, Wilson. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Jay.
Last Saturday, we followed you around Iolani Palace, where you are a docent. And today I would like to talk about how you got to be a docent, what you do as a docent, how you learned as a docent, and what it all means. And that was supposed to be your last docent tour at Iolani Palace, but it's not true. There will be more, I think.
Well, Cindy has asked me to do VIP tours, which I do on occasion, and the Chief Justice of Hawaii Supreme Court has been kind enough to say he wants me to do some tours in February of next year for a group that's coming in.
You've been doing these tours for a decade after other careers you've had in the law and litigation and other things you've done for the community, such as being on the panel that evaluates judges, which is really important. You were on there a long time. And this is sort of the most recent chapter in your service to the community. So we want to talk about that. We're calling the show A Decade in the Royal Court, and that's a double entendre at Iolani Palace. So let me first ask, what was your first contact with the palace? I already know the answer. What was your first contact with the palace, even as a child here growing up in Honolulu?
Well, of course, Shirley Temple was a huge movie star in 1935. There were thousands to meet her at the boat when she came, and apparently when my parents heard that she was going to sing at Iolani Palace, my father took me down, and I remember being up on his shoulders and hear her singing from the upper Makai gallery of Iolani Palace, the good ship Lollipop, for which she was famous. And I remember that she had to sing from more than that one lanai because there were so many thousands of fans there. We were both pretty close to 7 years old, but she was a much older woman. She was 6 months older than I was.
Just to catch on that, so you say she could not do it just from one lanai. So I envision a palace surrounded by people on all four sides, and she moves from side to side to sing again, yeah?
I think the internet said something like 5,000 to 9,000 people on things.
Wow.
She was hugely popular back in those days.
Oh, yeah. I can't say I remember, but I recognize that.
But it's a fun story, and being a docent at the palace, that's one of the things that tourists like me to tell, because they like the personal contact with the palace before I became docent.
Yeah, and with the mainland. It was a national icon. It was the only royal palace in the country.
That's correct.
So then later on, you got involved again. You followed this at a distance, but there came a time when you got closer to it. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I was a lawyer for 40 some odd years, and casting around for something to give back to the community that had been so great to me. And one of our great friends is Alice Guild, which is an icon in this community. And Alice and my wife are great friends in the garden club. And Alice said, Willie's got a good gift to gab. Why don't you get him to be into the training of the docent? So I looked into it. They accepted me. And I entered the training in the spring of 2009. And Zita Cup Choi is the marvelous educator up there at Iolani Palace, and she not only taught me an awful lot of what I needed to know, but infected me with such a desire to learn more about the monarch life in the palace that I did a lot of collateral reading. I probably did more than I should have because some of my tours kind of run over, but it was fun to do.
Well, it's interesting because you brought to that your experience as a lawyer and a litigator, a researcher, and somebody who can talk to people. All those things came together, and now we have somebody who's willing in his retirement to be a docent. That's quite something. Those are a lot of skills. And I suppose, you gave tours that were different than the customary kind of tour. Am I right?
I think every docent brings to the palace their own experiences, their own reflections on the life of Hawaii back in those days. And I think our job really is to not only show off the palace, which is a marvelous restoration, but to try and tell people what it was like for the monarchs to live in those hallowed rooms with those wonderful artifacts, and in the process teach a little bit about Hawaiian and monarch history. But it was more fun than work, I'll tell you that.
Oh, sure. And it's the stories that bring it alive, that make it memorable, not only for tourists who come around, but for local people who'd never heard the stories before. Taking the tour with you last Saturday, there were many, many stories. And we are doing a movie for OC16. It's actually going to be in 2 parts. It's all about Willie Moore and Iolani Palace. And there's a lot to it. There's a lot of material there. So take a look at that. It'll start in a few weeks on OC16. And it'll run altogether, for 2 weeks and 14 separate showings. So it'll be worthwhile looking at. But let's talk about, the tours that you give. You take us into a room. You talk about all the icons and artifacts in the room. You talk about the people who were in the room, what they did in the room, even how they got along in the room, why they were there, what they aspired to, and how they fit into Hawaii history. That's really something. And your tour is just, you don't take a breath, do you?
Well, you've got so much to cover, and we're under a time limit. We're supposed to finish the 2 floors, the upper floors in Iolani Palace in 45 minutes. And like I tell you, I talk so much, they sometimes call me Waha Willie, which means mouth in Hawaiian, as I tell too many stories. But I think my job, in addition to telling everybody about Iolani Palace and what it means to all the Hawaiian people, is to be entertaining and to make the tourists want to come back again. So that's part of I think that's an important part of any tour.
For a decade. How many times a week were you doing that for a decade?
We had a home in British Columbia, a summer home. And so when you finish the contract, you sign an agreement that you will do the tours at least for once a week for a year. And because I was gone so much in the summer, I signed up for 2. So I did Tuesdays and Fridays. And we sold the place in British Columbia a couple of years ago, but I just continued to do the 2 tours. And I think I ended up with something like 610 tours or something.
That's a lot of tours.
Well, no, but it was more fun than work.
Yeah, sure. I saw you having fun when I followed you. I actually followed you twice, as you may recall.
Oh, that's right. I
took
remember
you
that.
tour twice.
Remember that.
So, in the tour, you have Q&A, and I wonder what kind of...
No, 2 a week.
2 a week. You have Q&A. You have people asking you questions, people who know a lot about the palace, and people maybe who don't know anything about the palace. How do you handle that? And have those questions been a help in conducting these tours, or do they sidetrack you?
Yes and no. They don't sidetrack. I don't know the answers to every question that's asked, of course. I know most about what each room represents, and I know we're taught generally what all the artifacts in the room are, paintings and so on and so forth. But you're stumped occasionally. But the questions usually belie the interest of the tour group, so then you can guide your presentation more toward that question, because that's helpful in that way.
It tells you what they're interested in.
Of course.
It tells you what they want to hear, and you can adapt yourself. So, you took us, I'm sure there's more to it, but you took us to the main floor where the stairway goes up. You took us to the top floor. I guess.
Yeah, the public area is the main area where the public is invited and visits the monarch. The upper floor is the private apartments, and there's stories in every single room.
Yeah, it's really incredible to hear the stories pour out. And I guess my favorite place was the throne room, and I want to ask you about that. And then below the main floor, there's another floor.
Lower gallery, the lower gallery. And if the royal family was in residence, I think the history books say there was probably 60 servants in the palace to take care of the royal family. The lower gallery is where the offices are, the storerooms, the kitchen, things like that.
And you get to know the royal family. You get to know the dynasties that were there. You get to know how they thought, what they did, how they lived. This is very interesting stuff. So Who's your favorite royal person? Who's your favorite king? Do you have a favorite king?
Well, I think Kalakaua, of course, was the inhabitant of the palace the longest and left the greatest mark on it. Probably the
Yeah.
Kalakaua, but they're all interesting.
Yeah. And Iolani spent some time being imprisoned in the palace after the overthrow.
1895, there was a rebellion, and as a result of that rebellion, she was arrested in January of 1895, and some say on less than convincing evidence, but at least that's what happened. And then in February, she suffered the indignity of her trial in her own throne room, and then was house arrest in what is called the imprisonment room for 7 months and 20 some odd days. And then she was paroled and had to stay on the islands for a while, and then within a year after the original trial, she was totally pardoned.
All tragic.
All tragic.
And you can, walking through the palace, you can, as you unroll the history, and you can feel the tragedy of it. There's a quilt there. Can you talk about the quilt?
Well, the quilt was started, I don't know as much as I should, but the quilt was started by Queen Iolani and her two ladies-in-waiting, who there was one that was with her during the week, Jenny Wilson, and then there was another lady that came in on the weekend. And they started this quilt, what my grandmother used to call a crazy quilt, because it's an odd shaped pattern of snatches of cloth. And unlike most crazy quilts, these are pieces of old ball gowns, and so very, very flashy. And interwoven into the quilt is a lot of writing, which makes it very, very unique. So there's some interesting writing all over it.
Very personal to see that writing.
Very personal, no question about that.
Yeah. And I think one of my favorite rooms, I have many favorite rooms there, but is that big dining room hall where the king sat alongside the table instead of at the head of the table, and conducted conversations with visiting sea captains and the like. Can you talk about that?
Well, that's the reason for that is communication. Back in those days, in order to visit Hawaii, you have to come by sailing ship, and that's 2 weeks. And 2 weeks means 2 weeks for a newspaper to get here. So the king had no way to get up-to-date information except to have a meal, or probably talk was more important than food. And by sitting in the middle of the table, he could be in the center of things and invite people like the captains in the harbor and his officers and the visiting minister, or even the opera star was across the street. And then from that, he would find out what was going on in the world, probably a protracted meal longer than it would normally be, but the king that way got up to snuff on what was going on in the world.
Wished I'd been there. Would have been nice, but you know, following your tour, it was like I was there.
Well, that's nice to say.
And then you say the opera across the street. What was that about?
The opera house was right across the street where today is the Federal Building. And so the opera star would have been certainly invited just right across the street. And certainly whatever minister had been at the palace, and they say Robert Louis Stevenson ate at that very table in 1883, and then whatever ship was in port, the captain and the officers would be invited, and that's where the king would find out what was going on in the world.
That's where the action was. Interesting that it was at the same location as the Federal Building, because I know you spent a lot of time in that Federal Building.
Well, I used to try cases there, and I was Judge Wiggs' law clerk when I first came back from law school.
Did you go to law school?
I went to Hastings Law School, which at that time was an adjunct of the University of California at Berkeley, and now it's really a part of it. But when I came back, there was a residency rule that was in vogue, and you had to be a resident of Hawaii in order to practice law or take the bar. So I had to wait a year, and that's what I did. I was Judge Wiggs' law clerk over in the federal court. And then my father was assistant district attorney there for 13 years. So I had been through the federal court as a child visiting my dad. So I knew people there even before I was Judge Wiggs' law clerk.
And as you walked the floors of Iolani Palace, all of this played into that. We're going to take a short break, Willie. This is Willie Moore. He's a retired lawyer, a retired community contributor, a retired docent, but not fully retired, from Iolani Palace. We'll be right back after this short break. Yeah, Wilson Moore, now 90 and a half, soon to be 90 and 2/3. Eh?
Don't remind me.
I'm sorry. A decade in the royal court at Iolani Palace. It's a double entendre. And in fact, the legislature for a long time after the territory of Hawaii, after the overthrow, met in Iolani Palace. And you worked in the Iolani Palace. Some say you worked in the same spaces that Steve McGarrett worked in. Am I right?
No. No. From what I understand, Hawaii Five-0 took some exterior shots of the palace, but that which looked like the interior of the palace was on a film set. I don't think they ever filmed from inside. But
you were really there.
But I did work in the palace back in the 1950s. I was a deputy attorney general, as I mentioned before. And my job was the Harbor Board. And as the Harbor Board deputy...
Harbor Boy?
Board of Harbor Commissioners. Okay. Territorial Board of Harbor Commissioners. I think as you drive through Iolani, you still see one of the harbor buildings with that on it. Territorial Board of Harbor Board for short. And the legislature indeed met downstairs, which was a tragic use of those buildings. Luckily, they're restored. But if they passed a bill that had something to do with harbors, then I had to investigate the impact, and then I had to write a report to the governor. The governor in those days was William Quinn, and he was the last governor under the territory, and he was the first elected governor after 1959. And so I had to write a report to the governor. Governor, this is to explain bill number such and such. I recommend that you approve it. I recommend you veto it. And he'd call me occasionally on the phone and say, Willie, I need to talk to you. And up those Iolani Palace stairs I would climb, and into the governor's office I would come and discuss the bill with the governor. But we have restored that same room as King Kalakaua bedroom. That's exactly the way it's furnished today.
So when you walk through that room and give tours through that room, you're thinking of the way it was for the Harbor Board.
70 years ago.
Oh, my goodness. Those were the days. Hawaii was a different place than then.
No question.
Anyway, so I want to talk about other rooms there that
Sure.
I particularly enjoyed. There was a room where there were icons on the table. I think there was a poker table in there. And this is
That's the king's bedroom.
Yeah, these are the spaces where the king would enjoy, sit back, recreate, whatnot. Can you talk about those rooms?
Well, actually, that you're talking about the poker table in the king's bedroom, actually we think was located in the king's boathouse that jutted out into Honolulu Harbor. In fact, I have been told it has been photographed in there. And he had so much fun in that room that historians like to call that room the snuggery, his boathouse. His boathouse. And that's where the poker table was, but he loved to play poker. He played a lot of poker.
Stories about winning and losing big time in those poker games.
Yeah, lots of it. And there was Robert Louis Stevenson played at that table too. So a lot of historical figures.
And the palace is filled with objects reflecting his trips. He was enlightened. He took trips. He sent members of his court on trips. And he became a global figure, which was remarkable because these are little wee islands in the middle of nowhere, and he's traveling, and his family is traveling everywhere. Can you talk about that?
Well, he spoke flawless English, and that was a great advantage when he was traveling. But yes, you're right. He loved to travel. Yeah, one trip in 1881, 10 months, 17 countries around the world, and he collected. He was a very hail fellow, well met, very well spoken, very handsome figure. Accounts of his appearances in Washington and San Francisco and London very favorable to the impression that he made. And he brought things back. I think in my tour in Iolani Palace, there's two magnificent vases in the king's bedroom that he acquired in Japan, and they were sold off by auctioneers and went through a number of families, and luckily one of the latest families that had it have donated it back to the palace, and we have them back, and they're magnificent vases. So there's a number of things that he acquired.
And there were so many things, tragically, that were taken and sold after the overthrow. It was dismembered in many ways, and luckily, the friends of the palace and other people who were friends of the palace managed to get a lot of that back, but it's not all back yet.
We've gotten 40 to 50% of the contents back, and you're right. Queen Kapiolani's executors, Liliuokalani's executors, and the government sold the contents off, much of the contents anyway, and people would buy and then scatter to the four winds. But we have a little bit of a treasury that you can use to buy things up. For instance, if we see something on Sotheby's that claims to be an artifact from Iolani Palace and it bumps the price because of it, we will do our investigation, or the curators do. And if it is in fact ours, we'll see if we have enough money in the kitty to buy it. And if we don't, we'll walk downtown and suggest to one of the businessmen that they could make a contribution to Iolani Palace. And that's how we've gotten 40 to 50% of the things back.
So many stories in Iolani Palace. One of the things I did not know was there came a time when the kings were elected by popular vote in this state.
Well, of course, there was natural succession as long as the Kamehamehas were alive. But the original Constitution, way back in 1840, decreed that if there was no other way to do it, then it should be by election. And so when King Kamehameha V, Lot, died, now the Kamehameha line is gone, so you have no royal line for automatic succession, and that required the first election in 1873, and who should get elected but Lunalilo. And unfortunately, he contracted tuberculosis, did 13 months in office. We have to have another election in 1874, and the contenders that time were Emma, the Queen Dowager, and Kalakaua. And Kalakaua, of course, won that election and became king.
So interesting. I can't think of another royalty anywhere where the king is elected by popular vote. That's extraordinary. Only in Hawaii. The other only in Hawaii story that I remember, it really very memorable, was the attempt to marry Iolani off to the son of the emperor in Japan. That's a fabulous. Can you talk about that?
Well, King Kalakaua in 1881 made a trip around the world, and he stopped first in the United States, and then his first foreign stop was in Japan, and it was a marvelous event. The emperor was quite taken with the king. And the king was always looking for a political alliance. But besides that, he was really quite taken with one of the Japanese princes. Thought the young man was a very fine young man. So he proposed to the Japanese government a future marriage contract between Princess Iolani and this young prince. And I think Iolani was very young, maybe only 6 years old at the time, but a future marriage contract. But Japan said no. And as I say in my tour, but how interesting to think how different Japan, Hawaii, the United States, and maybe the world would have been had that marriage taken place.
Very provocative thought. That really catches me. And indeed, it would have been very different. You can attribute so many events to that union. It would be amazing. So we went to the throne room. You took us to the throne room, which is, I guess, the biggest single room in the palace.
Yes, it's just the ceremonial center of the palace, of course.
And it had a couple of thrones there, really beautiful with gold.
23 karat gold thrones. They were their original thrones, of course, part of that original manufacture from the Davenport Company, who later made furniture for the White House. And they were, at the time of the overthrow, they were taken to Bishop Museum for safekeeping. They were not auctioned off. And then in the 1970s, after the Capitol building had been built and the government put in the Capitol building, then the thrones were brought back into the throne room, and that's where they are today.
What was it like, to be royalty, to be one of the chamberlains, for example, in the palace, to be part of the royal family, the royal court, as it were? Because the common people, the ordinary folk, didn't get in there, at least on, except on special occasion. What was it like to be in the throne room and to rule? That's one thing that has always interested me. What was it like during the royalty vis-a-vis the royals and the not royals?
Well, you're asking somebody who doesn't have that depth of knowledge, not studied that particularly, but I can only imagine that I know from my reading that the Hawaiians almost deified their royalty. They thought they were godlike. And everything is red, the color red. Red was the color of the gods. That was the color of the elite, the nobles, the royalty. The public was, I think, invited on certain occasions. There were royal balls held in the throne room. The royalty was held, of course, in very, very high esteem. But I think they're very proud of the showplace that King Kalakaua had provided, the palace built in 1882. So.
Yeah, and it's clear the palace is a symbol of the kind of progress that Hawaii and the monarchy was making in the 19th century. They had come from a place which was not at all sophisticated in, say, the year 1800. By the time of the overthrow, they had achieved world repute. They had achieved all kinds of tech. They were lit with electricity before the White House was, you said, yeah?
1880, that's right.
Yeah.
1887 was the first year. 1886 was the first year the exterior was electrified. 1887, the interior of the palace was electrified 4 years before the White House. That's a very forward-thinking guy.
Telephones they had.
They had telephones. I think there were at least 300 subscribers in Honolulu at 1883, and by golly, the king was certainly one. And what you saw on the wall in the library was the original phone. I think the original one is in Bishop Museum, but this is an identical copy.
Yeah, extraordinary how Hawaii was so progressive through that whole century, and it's all reflected in the palace. If you look at the things you were showing us, you realize that they were making really incredible progress. They were globally minded, globally aware, and I can understand why the people admired them. They were leaders in a community that respected leaders, but that was also current in the global scene. If I were an ordinary citizen in that period, I would have been proud of them. I would have admired them, and I would have been loyal to them.
Well, I think that's very true. Remember, Hawaii was very literate back in those days.
Yes.
Thanks to the missionaries and converting an oral language to a written language in the late 1800s, Hawaii is said to have been the most literate nation in the world. So they had a knowledge of the outside world. And of course, in a strategic location in the middle of the Pacific, they had traders from all over the world. So they had interests from the Russians and the French and the English and the Americans primarily traded there. So they had quite a bit of knowledge of the world.
Yeah. So if you want to go back and live that century again, if you want to see what happened, if you want to be there and be part of it somehow, you should go to Iolani Palace. But I want to offer you this last opportunity in our show to address the people, to tell them what you would like them to remember about the palace, and what you think they ought to do about preserving the palace and visiting the palace. There's camera 4.
Well, I think the palace is a blessing for all the people. It reminds people of a bygone day, yes, but of a rich history that the Hawaiians have. And it was a real privilege for me to be a part of it for 10 years. I felt that I gave back as much as I got back as much as I gave. You can't teach all that and have that interaction with people without a lot of it rubbing off on you. And I would certainly encourage people to take their retirement and do something like that, because it's a blessing and a lot of fun too.
Thank you, Willie Moore. Really appreciate your service in many ways to this community and to the palace. Appreciate you coming down here. And we'll see you next week, because next week we're going to do another show with Willie Moore. We're going to talk about his life and time in practicing law here, back many years ago when he was an aviation lawyer. We want to hear about the very interesting cases he handled. Thank you, Willie. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Ugh.